You're standing in the throne room, watching your king eat his breakfast. He tears into a roast chicken with his bare hands, grease running down his jeweled rings, bits of meat catching in his beard. He belches, wipes his mouth on his ermine sleeve, and then, without missing a beat, reaches down to scratch vigorously at his crotch. His hand emerges, and he examines his fingernails with mild interest before plunging them back into the communal bread bowl. You're not disgusted. You can't afford to be. Because in medieval Europe, this wasn't considered barbaric. This was Tuesday. And what's worse? That king probably hasn't bathed in 6 months, on purpose. See, we have this romantic idea about royalty, don't we? Glittering courts, elegant manners, refined tastes. But the truth is so much more horrifying. The people who ruled empires, who commanded armies, who literally held the power of life and death over millions, many of them, were walking biological disasters. And I'm not talking about the occasional unwashed peasant. I'm talking about kings and queens who turned filth into a lifestyle choice, who made hygiene decisions so catastrophically bad that they literally changed the course of history. So if you think you know how disgusting the past was, buckle up, because what you're about to hear is going to make you grateful for soap, running water, and the fact that you weren't born into European nobility. Let's start with something that sounds innocent enough: makeup. Specifically, the makeup worn by Queen Elizabeth I of England. Now, Elizabeth was considered one of the great beauties of her age, celebrated in poetry and paintings. But here's what those paintings don't show you: the smell. Elizabeth, like most wealthy women of the 16th century, used a foundation called Venetian ceruse. Sounds fancy, right? It was basically white lead mixed with vinegar. Yes, lead. The same substance that causes brain damage, kidney failure, and a delightful array of neurological problems. But it gave you that fashionable deathly pale complexion that screamed, "I'm so rich, I never go outside." Elizabeth slathered this toxic paste on her face daily, building it up in layers so thick that by her later years, courtiers claimed you could see the cracks in her makeup from across the room. The lead was literally eating away at her skin, creating sores and blemishes, which she then covered with more lead makeup. It was a vicious cycle of vanity and poison. But it gets worse. To achieve the look of youth, she also used belladonna deadly nightshade to dilate her pupils and make her eyes look larger and more luminous. Never mind that belladonna causes blurred vision, headaches, and with prolonged use can lead to blindness. Beauty is pain, right? Except this wasn't just pain. This was systematic self-poisoning in the name of maintaining an image. And Elizabeth wasn't alone. Women across Europe were doing the same thing, turning their faces into toxic waste sites. All because smooth, pale skin was the fashion. The lead would eventually cause hair loss, so Elizabeth wore increasingly elaborate wigs made from the hair of commoners, which were often infested with lice. She'd powder these wigs with scented powders to mask the smell of her rotting scalp underneath. Picture this. You're granted an audience with the Queen of England. You approach the throne, and as you get closer, the smell hits you. A mixture of perfume trying desperately to cover the scent of decaying skin, infected sores, and whatever was living in that wig. You bow, you deliver your message, and the whole time you're trying not to gag while this woman, this powerful ruler of an empire, sits there, with her face literally crumbling off her skull, her eyes unnaturally dilated, looking like a particularly unsuccessful corpse. And everyone just pretended this was normal. This was beauty. This was power. But Elizabeth's toxic makeup routine was nothing compared to the bathing habits or lack thereof of European royalty. See, there was this belief that lasted for centuries that water was dangerous. Not polluted water, mind you, all water. The theory, which was considered completely legitimate medical advice, was that water opened your pores and let disease in. Bathing, therefore, was basically inviting the plague into your body. So what did people do instead? They didn't wash. For months, sometimes years. King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, reportedly bathed only 3 times in his entire life. 3 baths in 77 years. Let that sink in. This man lived in the Palace of Versailles, literally the most opulent building in Europe, surrounded by gold and marble and priceless art. But he smelled like a cesspit. Instead of bathing, Louis and his court would change their linen undergarments frequently and douse themselves in perfume. The theory was that the clean linen would absorb the dirt and sweat, and the perfume would cover the smell. It didn't work. Visitors to Versailles consistently noted the overpowering stench that permeated the palace. It wasn't just body odor, though that was bad enough. People urinated and defecated in corners, behind curtains, in stairwells, because there weren't enough toilets for the thousands of courtiers living there. The palace of the Sun King smelled like an open sewer. Chamber pots were emptied out windows onto the streets below. The gardens of Versailles, those beautiful, carefully manicured gardens, were also the preferred outdoor toilet for nobles who couldn't make it back inside. There are records of groundskeepers complaining about having to navigate around human waste while maintaining the flower beds. And it wasn't just the French. King James I of England never bathed either, and his personal hygiene was so atrocious that courtiers would make excuses to avoid standing near him. He had a bizarre habit of never washing his hands, even after using the toilet or before meals. Historical accounts describe him as constantly scratching at himself, likely dealing with various skin conditions and infestations that come from never, ever washing. His tongue was said to be too large for his mouth, causing him to drool constantly, and he would wipe the drool on his sleeve, the same sleeve he'd been wearing for weeks. When he drank, he'd slobber into his cup, then pass it around for others to share. Imagine being a nobleman, having worked your entire life to gain favor at court, and then the king himself offers you a drink from his personal cup. You can see the drool floating in the wine. You can smell him from 3 feet away, but you have to drink. You have to smile. You have to pretend this is an honor. This was the man who commissioned the King James Bible, one of the most important religious texts in English history. He couldn't be bothered to wash his hands, but he had opinions on theology. The same fingers that never met soap were signing death warrants and international treaties. And here's the kicker all of this: the makeup poisoning, the refusal to bathe, the living in filth. This wasn't seen as disgusting by the people doing it. This was normal. This was how royalty lived. The idea that you should wash your body regularly with water was considered a strange, possibly dangerous foreign practice. Being clean was suspicious. It meant you were worried about something, or worse, that you had something to hide. The dirtier you were, in some ways, the more it proved you had nothing to fear from disease, because obviously if bathing caused illness and you never bathed, you were protected, right? The logic was insane, but it was accepted medical fact for hundreds of years. Now let's talk about King Henry VIII of England, because his story combines everything we've discussed so far and adds a few extra layers of horror. Henry is famous for having 6 wives, breaking with the Catholic Church, and being portrayed as a larger-than-life Renaissance prince. What's less discussed is that by the end of his life, he was a rotting, suppurating nightmare of a human being. In his youth, Henry was apparently quite fit and athletic, but after a jousting accident in his 30s left him with a leg wound that never properly healed, everything went downhill. The wound became a chronic ulcer, basically an open sore on his leg that oozed pus constantly. It would occasionally close over, and then the infection would build up underneath until it burst open again in what was described as an explosion of foul-smelling discharge. Doctors would have to deliberately keep the wound open to let it drain, meaning Henry spent the last decade of his life with a hole in his leg that constantly leaked infectious material. The smell was reportedly unbearable. Henry tried to cover it with perfumes and had his clothing specially designed to hide the bandages, but everyone knew. You could smell them coming. But Henry, being Henry, refused to acknowledge this as a problem. He continued to hold court, to conduct business, to woo wives, all while his leg was literally rotting. His health deteriorated rapidly. He gained massive amounts of weight, reaching somewhere around 400 pounds by some estimates. His waist measured 54 inches. He couldn't walk unassisted and had to be carried around in a specially designed chair. He had gout, which meant his joints were constantly inflamed and painful. He likely had diabetes. His diet consisted of massive quantities of meat. He could apparently consume an entire roasted swan at a sitting washed down with wine and ale. And because he wasn't bathing regularly, and because his wound was constantly oozing, and because he was so large that he couldn't properly clean himself, Henry was almost certainly dealing with severe hygiene issues that would have made his presence genuinely difficult to endure. His mood swings became legendary. He'd execute people on a whim, then regret it hours later. He'd fall madly in love with a woman, marry her, then tire of her, and find a way to get rid of her. Anne Boleyn, his second wife, was beheaded on likely fabricated charges of adultery and treason. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, was also beheaded for adultery. And through it all, Henry genuinely believed he was the victim. He saw himself as a great king dealing with ungrateful wives and treasonous subjects, never once considering that, maybe, just maybe, being married to a 400-pound man with a suppurating leg wound and violent mood swings wasn't exactly a dream come true. The portraits we have of late-period Henry show him magnificently dressed in jewels and furs, looking every inch the powerful monarch. What they don't show is what everyone in the room could smell: the rot, the infection, the decay happening in real time. This was the man who shaped the English Reformation, who changed the course of religious history in Europe, who created the Church of England. And he did it all while literally falling apart. When Henry died in 1547, his body was so bloated and infected that it reportedly exploded in his coffin, leaking fluids that had to be cleaned up by servants. Even in death, he was making life miserable for everyone around him. So there's your first section: the aristocratic rot, the glamorous decay, the crowned heads of Europe marinating in their own filth while ruling empires. And we're just getting started.